John Overcash walked out of Laos with gray hair at 26 years old after leading a 7-man recon team 20 miles inside enemy territory, burning down a North Vietnamese way station while an entire NVA battalion hid in tunnels just south of his position. And he didn't even know those enemy troops were there until his debriefing the next day. That's the kind of story that sounds made up until you hear it from the man himself. And then you realize that some of the craziest things that happened in Vietnam were just ordinary missions that went sideways in ways nobody could have predicted. John Overcash's story isn't just about one mission, though. It's about punji stakes and blood poisoning and newborn babies, and the strange way that war mixes the terrifying with the mundane, sometimes in the same week, sometimes in the same day. And it's about the kind of men who ran recon missions during the Vietnam War. Small teams operating deep in denied territory, where getting compromised didn't just mean a firefight, but potentially meant nobody ever finding out what happened to you. To understand what John Overcash went through, you have to understand what he was doing in Vietnam in the first place, and what kind of unit he was serving with. John Overcash was a Special Forces officer, a Green Beret, operating out of camps along the border regions of South Vietnam during the mid-1960s. His unit was involved in what were called cross-border operations, missions that took American and indigenous troops into Laos and Cambodia to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of roads and paths that North Vietnam used to funnel supplies and troops into South Vietnam. These operations were officially secret. The United States government denied they were happening. Laos and Cambodia were neutral countries, at least on paper, and acknowledging that American soldiers were conducting combat operations inside their borders would have created all kinds of diplomatic and political problems. So the missions happened, but they didn't officially happen, and the men who ran them operated in a kind of shadow world where the normal rules didn't always apply. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was the lifeline of the communist war effort in South Vietnam. Everything the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong needed to fight – weapons, ammunition, food, medicine, reinforcements – all of it came down that trail. The trail wasn't just one road, it was a whole network of routes, some of them well-developed roads that could handle truck traffic, others just footpaths through the jungle. It ran through the mountains and valleys of Laos and Cambodia, taking advantage of the fact that American ground forces couldn't officially operate there. Interdicting the trail, disrupting the flow of supplies, was one of the highest priorities of the American war effort. The Air Force bombed it constantly, but bombing alone couldn't stop the traffic. The North Vietnamese were incredibly resourceful at repairing damage and finding alternate routes. They had thousands of workers dedicated to keeping the trail open, and they moved most of their supplies at night when the bombers couldn't see them. So, ground operations were necessary too, and that's where units like John Overcash's came in. Recon teams would go into Laos, usually small groups of 3 Americans and 4 indigenous troops, often Vietnamese or Montagnard soldiers who had been trained by special forces. Their job was to gather intelligence, locate enemy supply caches and way stations, and call in airstrikes to destroy what they found. Sometimes they would set ambushes or plant mines and booby traps on the trails. Sometimes they would just watch and report. But always, they were operating in enemy territory, outnumbered, with limited support, knowing that if things went bad, extraction might not be possible. John Overcash had been running these kinds of operations for months when the sequence of events that would lead to his most memorable mission began. It started with a punji stake. Punji stakes were one of the simplest and most effective weapons the enemy used against American forces in Vietnam. They were sharpened bamboo sticks, usually hardened by fire, and sometimes coated with feces or other contaminants to cause infection. The Viet Cong and NVA would plant them in pits along trails, in the bottoms of streams, anywhere American soldiers might step. A punji stake wouldn't kill you, usually, but it would put a hole in your foot or leg that would take you out of action and require medical evacuation. And if the wound got infected, which it often did given the filthy conditions, it could become life-threatening. John Overcash stepped in a punji trap while he was out on a mission with a platoon, setting booby traps of their own on trails and bridges coming off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans used devices they called toe poppers, small plastic mines about 2 inches in diameter that would blow off a foot when someone stepped on them. The logic was brutal, but effective. A dead enemy soldier was one casualty. A wounded enemy soldier who couldn't walk was a casualty plus 2 or 3 more men who had to carry him and care for him. You could take 4 men out of action with 1 mine. Of course, the enemy was doing the same thing to the Americans. John Overcash has said that his unit took more casualties from booby traps than from any other cause. When John Overcash stepped in the punji trap, the stake went through his boot, through his lower leg, and came out the back of his boot about 4 inches. He had his radio operator jerk it out, which he's said hurt more than the initial wound. But the mission wasn't over, so Overcash kept moving. They still had to get to their landing zone for extraction. He walked 2 kilometers on that wounded leg, got on the helicopter, and flew back to base. The next day, John Overcash was scheduled to help run parachute training. His unit was teaching their indigenous troops how to do airborne insertions in case they ever needed to jump into an area they couldn't reach by helicopter quickly enough. Overcash was jump mastering the training jumps, supervising the operation, making sure everything went smoothly. They had about 50 parachutes that had been sent up from Pleiku, and the training area was just south of their camp. It was only after the parachute jumps were completed that John Overcash noticed something wrong with his leg. Blue streaks were running up from the wound site. Blood poisoning. The punji stake had introduced an infection into his system, and now that infection was spreading through his bloodstream. Without treatment, blood poisoning can kill you. John Overcash went down to Pleiku, where he had a buddy named Chuck Davis, who ran a medical aid station. Chuck Davis was a Medical Service Corps officer, and he took care of Overcash for a week. The treatment was straightforward but time-consuming. Overcash would soak the wound twice a day, and Davis would give him penicillin shots morning and night. Slowly, the blue streaks disappeared. The infection was beaten back. But the doctors didn't want Overcash going back into the field for at least another week. He needed time to fully recover. When John Overcash got back to his camp, his commanding officer, Colonel Call, had an offer for him. Since Overcash couldn't go out on operations anyway, the colonel said he could catch a Marine flight back to Okinawa. Overcash's wife, Judy, was there with their children, and their 3rd daughter, Jenny, had just been born. Overcash hadn't seen her yet. So he flew back to Okinawa, spent time with his wife and babies, and for a little while, the war was somewhere else. But the war was waiting for him when he got back. On his way back into Vietnam, John Overcash called Colonel Call to check in, and the colonel told him to come by the office. There was something special he wanted to talk about. When Overcash arrived, Colonel Call explained the situation. The recon teams that were running cross-border operations had been having problems. The teams were typically led by senior enlisted men, E7s or E8s, sergeants first class, or master sergeants. These were experienced, capable team leaders who knew what they were doing. But the teams also included Vietnamese soldiers, and some of those Vietnamese soldiers were lieutenants, officers. And the Vietnamese lieutenants had started refusing to take orders from the American sergeants. It was a rank issue, a cultural issue, a pride issue. Whatever the reason, It was causing problems in the field, and problems in the field on a recon mission could get everyone killed. Colonel Call wanted to try something new. He wanted to put an American officer in as a team leader, someone who outranked the Vietnamese lieutenants and could keep the chain of command clear. John Overcash was going to be the first officer to lead a recon team. Overcash had mixed feelings about this assignment. On one hand, it was a sign of trust from his commander, recognition that he could handle a difficult and sensitive mission. On the other hand, running a recon team was probably more dangerous than operating with a platoon. With a platoon, you had numbers. With a recon team, you had 7 men, total, operating 20 miles inside enemy territory with no quick reinforcement available if things went wrong. And John Overcash only had about a week left in country. He was scheduled to rotate back to Okinawa. Getting killed on your last week in Vietnam was a particular kind of tragedy that everyone dreaded. But orders were orders, and John Overcash was a professional soldier. He started preparing for the mission. Preparing for a recon mission meant doing reconnaissance of the reconnaissance, if that makes sense. Overcash and his team flew over the objective area at high altitude, trying to get a sense of the terrain without alerting the enemy to their interest. They picked their primary landing zone, their alternate LZs, their emergency extraction points. They studied their route from the insertion point to the objective. They gathered whatever intelligence was available about enemy activity in the area. The objective for this mission was an area suspected of containing an ammunition dump, a POL dump, which means petroleum, oil, and lubricants, and a food supply cache. The enemy needed all of these things to keep their forces operating in South Vietnam, and finding and destroying a major supply point would be a significant achievement. There was also intelligence suggesting a way station in the area, one of the rest stops and resupply points the North Vietnamese had established along the trail network. Recon teams always inserted at a specific time, after sunset but before full dark. That window gave them just enough light to see what they were doing while making it harder for the enemy to observe the helicopters and figure out exactly where the team had been dropped. On this mission, they used multiple landing zones as a deception measure. The helicopters would stop at 2 or 3 different LZs, and the team would get off at a pre-planned one while the enemy, if they were watching, wouldn't know which stop was the real insertion point. John Overcash's team went in clean. No contact on the LZ, everything quiet. They moved a couple hundred meters up a ridge line to their overnight position and settled in to listen. On a recon mission, you spend a lot of time just listening. The jungle at night is full of sounds, and if you know what to listen for, those sounds can tell you a lot. Enemy soldiers moving through the brush. Signals like the beating of bamboo poles that the North Vietnamese used to communicate over long distances. Any of those sounds could mean you'd been detected, that the enemy knew you were there and was coming for you. That first night, John Overcash and his team heard nothing alarming. Either the enemy hadn't noticed their insertion, or there was no enemy in the immediate vicinity. The next morning, they made contact with their forward air controller, the FAC, the pilot flying overhead who would coordinate air support if they needed it. Moving without FAC contact was dangerous, because if the team got into trouble, they needed to be able to call for help immediately. With the FAC overhead and aware of their position, they started moving toward their objective. The first thing they found was a village on the other side of the ridgeline from where they'd spent the night. It looked deserted, but intelligence suggested it might be a way station, so they observed it for 8 hours, watching for any sign of activity. Nothing. No movement, no people, no indication that anyone was using the village. It had either been abandoned or relocated. With the village confirmed as empty, the team moved on toward the main objective area, about another kilometer to the south. When they got there, John Overcash found exactly what the intelligence had predicted: a huge food storage area. The rice cache alone was enormous. Thousands of pounds of rice, stored in a space as big as a large room. This was a major supply point, the kind of target that could make a real difference in the enemy's ability to sustain operations. Overcash split his team. He left 4 men, one of his American NCOs and 3 of the Vietnamese soldiers, to secure the rice cache, while he took 2 men and moved around the bend of the valley to look for the POL and ammunition dumps that were supposed to be nearby. They had only gone a short distance when John Overcash heard gunfire behind him. Not enemy weapons. His own team's weapons. They were carrying Swedish Ks, a type of submachine gun that was popular with special forces because it was reliable, compact, and had a distinctive sound. Overcash heard all 4 Swedish Ks firing on full automatic, which meant his team was in contact with multiple enemies. Overcash and his 2 men took off running back toward the rice cache. When they got there, the situation was almost resolved. 4 North Vietnamese soldiers had walked right into the position, apparently unaware that an American recon team was there. Overcash's men had opened fire immediately, killing 3 of them on the spot. The 4th had tried to run, sprinting out across a rice paddy, and they had just shot him down as Overcash arrived. 4 enemy dead, no friendly casualties. In a tactical sense, it was a success, but for a recon team operating 20 miles inside another country, a firefight meant the mission was compromised. The shots had been heard. The enemy knew someone was there. The clock was now ticking on how long before a larger enemy force showed up to investigate. And that larger force might already be close. John Overcash had been briefed that there was possibly a battalion of NVA troops somewhere in the vicinity of the way station they were looking for. A battalion, somewhere between 300 and 800 men, depending on strength, against 7. If those troops found Overcash's team, it would be a slaughter. With the mission compromised, the priority now was destruction and extraction. John Overcash called in airstrikes on the supply dump. 2 F-4 Phantoms came in and started dropping bombs on the rice cache and the surrounding area. The explosions were massive, and then they got bigger. Secondary explosions, 12 of them. That meant the bombs were hitting stored ammunition or fuel, causing additional detonations. The supply dump was even bigger than they had realized, and it was going up in flames. But those secondary explosions created a new problem. Debris was being thrown up over the ridgeline and falling down on top of Overcash's team. They were only about 200 meters from the target area on the back side of the ridge, and chunks of whatever was being blown up were raining down around them. They had to move. John Overcash and his team took off running in the opposite direction from the explosions. They covered 200 or 300 meters, putting distance between themselves and the bombs. And then, they ran straight into the way station they had been looking for. It wasn't where they expected it to be. From the air, you couldn't see it at all. The jungle canopy hid everything. But there it was, a brand new North Vietnamese way station with all new buildings, right next to what Overcash had already designated as his emergency landing zone. The emergency LZ was only about 25 meters from the way station. They had picked it from aerial photos without any idea what was hidden under the trees. The way station looked empty. No soldiers visible, but there were pigs squealing and chickens running around, the sounds of a village that had been occupied moments before. The North Vietnamese soldiers who had been there had jumped into their tunnels, their underground hiding places, when the bombs started falling. They were still there, just below the surface, probably listening to what was happening above them, trying to figure out what was going on. John Overcash made a quick decision. He ordered his team to set fire to every building in the way station. They moved through the compound with speed and purpose, torching each structure. When bamboo burns, it pops and cracks like gunfire, and soon the whole area sounded like a battle was raging. Between the explosions still going off on the other side of the ridge and the noise of the burning village, the North Vietnamese in their tunnels apparently decided to stay put. They didn't emerge. They didn't engage. The helicopters arrived about 20 minutes later. John Overcash and his team sprinted to the LZ and climbed aboard. As they lifted off, the forward air controller came on the radio. He had 2 more F-4s available. Did Overcash want to finish this thing off? Overcash said yes. As soon as the helicopters cleared the area, the Phantoms came in and bombed the way station, destroying whatever the fires hadn't already consumed. It wasn't until later that John Overcash learned how close they had come to disaster. The North Vietnamese battalion that intelligence had warned about wasn't just somewhere in the area. They were positioned just south of the way station. If those troops had moved north to investigate the firefight, or if they had emerged from their positions when Overcash's team was burning the village, the 7-man recon team would have been overwhelmed. But the noise and confusion of the airstrikes and the fires apparently kept the NVA in place. They didn't know what was happening, couldn't assess the situation, and so they stayed where they were, while Overcash and his men extracted. John Overcash flew back to his base camp and then on to Da Nang for his debriefing. He brought all his gear with him because he was scheduled to rotate back to Okinawa the next day anyway. After the debriefing, he could just catch his flight home. During the debriefing, Colonel Call mentioned, almost casually, that intelligence had confirmed a battalion of North Vietnamese troops in the area of the way station. John Overcash was furious. He asked the colonel why that information hadn't been shared before the mission. They could have walked right into those troops. 7 men against a battalion. The colonel's response was that Overcash was leading a recon team, and recon teams were supposed to pick up that kind of information themselves. That was the job. Overcash had a hard time accepting that answer. He understood the nature of the mission, understood that recon teams operated in denied territory with incomplete information. But having intelligence about a possible enemy battalion in your objective area and not sharing it with the team leader felt like a betrayal. Those were his men out there. He was responsible for bringing them back alive. How could he do that job if he wasn't given the information that was available? It was the kind of thing that stayed with a man. John Overcash made it back to Okinawa that afternoon. His wife Judy came to the airport to pick him up. When she saw him, her first question was, "What happened to you?" John Overcash was 26 years old. He had been 26 when he left for that mission. But Judy noticed something different about him. He said he didn't have any holes in him this time. He was fine. And Judy said, "You're gray-headed." Somewhere during that mission, the stress and the fear and the knowledge of how close he had come to dying had turned John Overcash's hair gray. He didn't know exactly when it happened. Maybe during the firefight at the rice cache. Maybe during the explosions that sent debris falling around them. Maybe during those minutes in the burning way station, knowing that enemy soldiers were hiding in tunnels just feet away, not knowing if they would emerge shooting. Maybe during the helicopter ride out, looking down at the bombs falling on a target that had just been under his feet. The human body responds to extreme stress in strange ways. Hair doesn't actually turn gray overnight, not literally, but severe stress can cause changes that make it appear that way. Whatever the medical explanation, the visible effect was undeniable. John Overcash had gone into Laos a young man and come out looking older. The pungy stake wound that had started this whole sequence of events healed eventually. The blood poisoning was beaten. John Overcash would go on to have a full military career, would serve additional tours, would accumulate the experiences that veterans of that era carry with them. But that mission, the one that started with a bamboo spike through his leg and ended with gray hair and a burning way station and a battalion of enemy soldiers who never knew how close they came to catching an American recon team in the open, that was the one that stuck with him. There are details in John Overcash's account that tell you something about what that war was really like for the men who fought it. The toe poppers that would blow off a foot, the way teams always inserted in that narrow window after sunset but before dark, the system of multiple LZs to confuse the enemy about where you actually got off the helicopter, the Swedish Khe submachine guns that Special Forces preferred, the forward air controllers circling overhead, the lifeline that connected small teams on the ground to the massive firepower of American air assets, the tunnels that the North Vietnamese dug everywhere, allowing them to disappear underground when the bombs started falling. These were the tools and tactics of a particular kind of war, a shadow war fought in places that officially didn't exist, by men whose missions were classified and whose sacrifices were often unacknowledged. The cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia were some of the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. The teams that ran them operated with minimal support in areas where the enemy was present in force. If a team got into trouble, extraction might not be possible. If a team was wiped out, there might be no way to recover the bodies. The men who volunteered for these missions knew the risks. They went anyway. John Overcash's mission was successful by any military measure. They located and destroyed a major enemy supply dump. They found and burned a way station. They killed 4 enemy soldiers in direct combat. They got secondary explosions that indicated significant stores of ammunition or fuel had been destroyed. And they extracted without losing a man. But success in war doesn't mean the experience is easy or that it doesn't leave marks. John Overcash came home gray-headed, carrying memories that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The relationship between John Overcash and Colonel Call illustrates something about the friction that existed within military organizations during Vietnam. Colonel Call had information about the enemy battalion. He chose not to share it with Overcash before the mission. His reasoning, that recon teams were supposed to develop that kind of intelligence themselves, made a certain kind of sense from an operational standpoint. You don't want teams becoming dependent on external intelligence that might be wrong or outdated. You want them to trust their own observations and react to what they actually find on the ground. But from John Overcash's perspective, withholding that information put his team at unnecessary risk. If he had known about the battalion, he might have planned differently, moved differently, been prepared for a larger enemy presence than he encountered. The 4 NVA soldiers who walked into his position might have been scouts from that battalion. The battalion itself might have been preparing to move when the firefight broke out. Any number of things might have happened differently if Overcash had had the full picture. This kind of tension between different levels of command, between those who have information and those who need it, is a constant in military operations. It's not unique to Vietnam, but in Vietnam, where the nature of the enemy and the complexity of the battlefield made accurate intelligence so critical, these failures of communication could be deadly. John Overcash and his men survived despite the gaps in what they knew. Other teams, in other missions, were not always so fortunate. The physical toll that combat takes on the human body is another theme that runs through John Overcash's story. The punji stake that went through his leg, the blood poisoning that followed, the gray hair that appeared after his mission into Laos. These are visible manifestations of what combat does to people. There are invisible effects too, psychological effects that don't show up in photographs but that shape veterans' lives for decades after they come home. John Overcash has talked about his experiences with the kind of matter-of-fact honesty that many combat veterans develop. He doesn't dramatize what happened. He doesn't make himself out to be more heroic than he was. He tells the story the way he remembers it, with all the mundane details that don't usually make it into the history books. The parachute training that he was running the day he noticed the blood poisoning. The buddy in platoon who took care of him for a week. The flight to Okinawa to see his newborn daughter. The colonel who let him go and then called him back for one more mission. These details are what make the story real. They're what separate the actual experience of war from the sanitized versions that appear in movies and official histories. The way station that John Overcash and his team burned was one of many that the North Vietnamese established along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These way stations served multiple purposes. They were rest stops where troops moving south could sleep and eat. They were supply points where units could pick up ammunition, food, and equipment. They were medical stations where wounded soldiers could be treated. They were the infrastructure that made the whole supply line function. Destroying a way station didn't stop the flow of supplies down the trail. The North Vietnamese would just build another one somewhere else. But it disrupted operations, forced the enemy to expend resources on reconstruction, and occasionally caught supplies or personnel in the destruction. Every way station that burned, every supply cache that exploded, was a small victory in a war that was fought one small victory at a time. The recon teams that ran these missions were essential to the interdiction effort. Without eyes on the ground, the Air Force was bombing blind. The teams found targets, confirmed intelligence, and called in strikes with precision that aerial observation alone couldn't provide. John Overcash's mission was a textbook example of how this process was supposed to work. Find the target, confirm it, call in the air, destroy it, extract. The fact that it almost went badly wrong, that a firefight compromised the mission and a battalion of enemy troops was closer than anyone realized, doesn't change the fundamental success of the operation. It just illustrates how thin the margins were. The transformation that John Overcash underwent during his time in Vietnam, symbolized by that gray hair, was something many veterans experienced. They went to war as young men and came back changed in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. Some of those changes were physical, wounds and scars and disabilities that lasted a lifetime. Some were psychological, the memories and anxieties and perspectives that combat creates. Some were both. John Overcash's gray hair was a visible sign of invisible stress, a marker of what he had been through that his wife recognized the moment she saw him. The families of Vietnam veterans often talk about how their loved ones came back different, quieter, or more volatile, distant or hypervigilant, changed in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Judy Overcash saw it in her husband's hair before she saw it anywhere else. He was 26 years old and gray-headed, and she knew without being told that something significant had happened. The mission itself was officially secret. The fact that American Special Forces were operating in Laos was not something the government acknowledged. John Overcash couldn't tell his wife the details of where he had been or what he had done. That secrecy was its own burden, carried by thousands of veterans who served in the Shadow War and came home unable to talk about their experiences, even to the people closest to them. The lifting of that secrecy, decades later, has allowed veterans like John Overcash to finally tell their stories. The operations in Laos and Cambodia are no longer classified. The men who ran those missions can now speak openly about what they did and what they saw. That openness has been healing for many veterans, a chance to process experiences that were bottled up for years and to receive recognition for service that was officially invisible for so long. John Overcash's account of his mission, is part of that larger project of remembrance and acknowledgement. The choice to send an officer to lead a recon team, rather than the senior NCOs who had traditionally held that role, reflects the complexity of the advisory mission in Vietnam. The American military was trying to build effective South Vietnamese forces while also conducting its own operations. That meant working through and around issues of culture, language, and military hierarchy that didn't always map neatly from one system to another. A Vietnamese lieutenant who wouldn't take orders from an American sergeant might accept orders from an American captain. The solution was imperfect, but it addressed a real problem that was affecting operations. John Overcash became the first officer to lead a recon team as an experiment in solving that problem. The experiment apparently worked, at least in his case. The mission was successful. The team came back intact. Whether the approach was adopted more broadly, whether other officers followed Overcash into the team leader role, is something the historical record would need to confirm. But for John Overcash personally, it was a significant assignment, a mark of trust from his commander and a responsibility he took seriously, despite the danger and despite being so close to the end of his tour. The timing of the mission, with only a week left in country, is one of those details that veterans remember with particular intensity. The short-timers mentality, the awareness that you were almost out, made every remaining day feel more dangerous than the ones that came before. Soldiers who had survived 11 months of combat became acutely aware of the possibility of dying in their final days, and that awareness could be paralyzing or focusing, depending on the individual. John Overcash admits he was nervous about the mission, in part because of the timing. He was supposed to be going home, and instead, he was being sent 20 miles into Laos to lead a recon team on a mission that might get him killed before he ever saw Okinawa again. He went anyway because that was the job. But the tension between the desire to survive and the obligation to serve is something every combat soldier understands. The secondary explosions that Overcash reported, 12 of them, indicate that the supply dump contained significant quantities of ammunition or fuel. Secondary explosions happen when the blast from one bomb sets off other explosives stored nearby. They're a sign that you've hit something important. 12 secondaries from one target is a substantial result, suggesting that the supply point was a major node in the enemy's logistics network. Destroying it would have had a real impact on operations in that part of Laos, and on the supplies reaching South Vietnam through that section of the trail. The forward air controller who asked if Overcash wanted to finish this thing off after the helicopter extraction was offering a chance to complete the destruction, to make sure nothing was left standing. Overcash said yes, and the additional airstrike leveled what remained of the way station. That kind of follow-through was important because the North Vietnamese were incredibly resourceful at salvaging and rebuilding. Anything left intact might be recovered and put back into use within days. Total destruction was the goal, and between the fires that Overcash's team set and the bombs that followed their extraction, that goal was achieved. The pigs and chickens that John Overcash mentions hearing in the way station were signs of the village life that existed alongside the military infrastructure. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't just a road, it was a whole ecosystem of way stations, villages, repair depots, hospitals, and camps that supported the troops and workers who kept the supplies moving. Burning a way station meant destroying someone's home, killing their animals, disrupting whatever semblance of normal life existed in those jungle clearings. War doesn't make clean distinctions between military and civilian, between legitimate targets and collateral damage. John Overcash and his team did what they were trained to do, what their mission required. The moral complexity of those actions is something each veteran has to reckon with in their own way. The tunnels that the North Vietnamese used to hide when the bombs fell were part of a larger system of underground fortifications that the Communists had been building for decades. They had learned during the French Indochina War that survival required getting below ground, and they had refined their tunnel-building techniques over years of conflict. Some tunnel complexes were enormous, with multiple levels, storage rooms, hospitals, command centers, everything needed to sustain operations even under heavy bombardment. The tunnels near the way station that Overcash encountered were probably simpler, just hiding places where the soldiers could wait out an airstrike. But they served their purpose. The NVA troops stayed underground, stayed hidden, and survived to fight another day. Overcash and his team burned the surface structures and got out, never engaging the larger force that was concealed just feet below them. John Overcash's story is one of thousands from the cross-border operations in Laos and Cambodia. Every team that went out came back with stories, if they came back at all. Some teams were wiped out, some were never found. Some fought their way through ambushes and extractions that make Overcash's mission look routine. The Shadow War along the Ho Chi Minh Trail was one of the most dangerous theaters of the entire Vietnam conflict, and the men who served there deserve recognition that they often didn't receive at the time. The official secrecy that surrounded their missions meant that they couldn't talk about what they had done, couldn't receive public acknowledgement of their service, couldn't be understood by a society that didn't know their operations existed. That has changed over the years as the classification barriers have come down and veterans have been able to share their experiences. John Overcash's willingness to tell his story is part of that larger process of bringing the Shadow War into the light. His account of the mission, the punji steak, the blood poisoning, the family visit to Okinawa, the assignment to lead a recon team, the firefight, and the airstrikes, and the burning way station and the gray hair. All of it contributes to our understanding of what the war was really like for the men who fought it. The small details matter: the Swedish K submachine guns, the toe poppers, the bamboo poles that the enemy used for signaling, the way helicopters would stop at multiple LZs to confuse surveillance, the specific timing of insertions, after sunset but before dark. These details are what separate real history from the generalized narratives that lose the texture of actual experience. John Overcash remembers these things because they were part of his daily reality for months on end. They were the difference between life and death. The debriefing where John Overcash learned about the battalion and confronted Colonel Call about not sharing that information is the kind of moment that reveals the human dynamics within military organizations: officers disagreeing, information being withheld, trust being tested. These things happen in every organization, but in a combat zone, the stakes are literally life and death. Overcash's anger at the colonel was justified from his perspective. The colonel's reasoning made sense from his. They were both right, in a way, and they were both operating under the pressures of a war that demanded impossible choices. The fact that Overcash had a hard time forgiving Colonel Call suggests that the breach of trust was real and lasting. It's the kind of thing that shapes how a soldier thinks about his commanders and about the institution he serves. Some veterans come out of those experiences with their faith in military leadership intact. Others come out cynical and distrustful. Most are somewhere in between, recognizing both the necessity of hierarchy and command and the failures and limitations of the individuals who exercise authority. John Overcash made it home. He saw his wife and daughters. He had survived his tour, survived the punji stake and the blood poisoning and the recon mission into Laos. He was gray-headed at 26, but he was alive. That was more than some of his comrades could say. The war continued after he left, continued for years. But John Overcash's part in it was done, at least for that tour. The memories would stay with him, as they stay with every combat veteran, the images and sounds and feelings that don't fade with time. Stories like John Overcash's don't always get told the way they deserve to be told. The cross-border operations were secret for so long that a whole generation grew up without knowing they happened. The veterans who served in those operations came home to a country that didn't understand what they had done, couldn't understand because the missions were classified and couldn't be discussed. That silence was its own kind of wound, added to all the other wounds that the war inflicted. Now, decades later, the stories can be told. Veterans like John Overcash can speak openly about their service, can share the details that were classified for so long, can receive the recognition that was denied them at the time. It's not enough to make up for years of silence and misunderstanding, but it's something. It's a chance to set the record straight, to honor the service of men who went into harm's way in the shadows and did their jobs with professionalism and courage. John Overcash stepped in a punji trap, got blood poisoning, flew to Okinawa to see his newborn daughter, came back and led a 7-man recon team into Laos, burned a North Vietnamese way station while an enemy battalion hid in tunnels nearby, extracted under fire, and came home gray-headed at 26. That's his story. It's not a Hollywood story. It's messier than that, more complicated, full of details that don't fit neatly into a narrative arc. But it's real. It happened. And it deserves to be remembered, along with all the other stories from that war, the stories of men who did extraordinary things in extraordinary circumstances, and then came home and tried to live ordinary lives with extraordinary memories. However you feel about the Vietnam War, about the policies and the politics and the decisions that sent men like John Overcash into the jungles of Laos, what those men did mattered. It mattered to them. It mattered to the men they served with. It mattered to the families waiting at home. And it still matters now as a testament to what ordinary people can do when they're asked to do the impossible. John Overcash was asked, and he answered. He went into Laos, did his job, and came home. That's what soldiers do. That's what they've always done. And that's why we tell their stories, so that what they did doesn't disappear into the silence of classified files and forgotten missions. John Overcash's gray hair was the price of 1 week in Laos. The memories are the price of a lifetime. But he's still here, still telling the story, still making sure that what happened in those jungles isn't forgotten. And that matters more than anything else.